Welcome to the Theology Made podcast. I'm Jordan. Today, we're going to look at how one Supreme Court case redefined religion in public life. There was a time, maybe your parents or grandparents remember it, when every school day in America began the same way. Students stood, they said the Pledge of Allegiance, and then they bowed their heads and prayed. But in 1962, that all changed. Not by a riot or a revolution, but by a single courtroom decision. One case, and a simple prayer that read,
Almighty God, we acknowledge our dependence upon Thee, and we beg Thy blessings upon us, our parents, our teachers, and our country.
It didn't mention Jesus, it wasn't specific to one religion, it was broad, generic, and wasn't mandatory. But when Engel v. Vitale went to the U.S. Supreme Court, that 22-word prayer was ruled unconstitutional. Today, we're going to look at how one lawsuit changed how we think about religion, power, and public life, and what happens when freedom of religion collides with freedom from religion. Section 1. The prayer that started it all. It all started, like most shifts in history, no protest, no riot, not even a charismatic leader, but with a quiet administrative decision. The year was 1951, post-war America. The baby boom was in full swing, and down a hall of the New York State Board of Regents, a group of civic-minded officials were trying to be, helpful. They weren't trying to spark a cultural war. If anything, they were trying to prevent one. The country was nervous, twitchy, paranoid. Think they're buying up all the toilet paper at Costco just in case. The Cold War had begun. The Red Scare was taking hold. Senator McCarthy was seeing communists in every corner, and communists, everyone knew, didn't believe in God. So what better way to affirm our Americanness, our not communistness, than by starting each school day with a short, simple prayer? So, the Board of Regents drafted one, 22 words long. No mention of Jesus, no theology, no denominational slant. To the Regents, it was safe. It was about as vanilla of a prayer as you could get. Harmless, the spiritual equivalent of the Pledge of Allegiance. And this is crucial, it wasn't mandatory. Do you hear that? It's not mandatory. Students could opt out, parents could write in, so they rolled it out. And for a while, almost no one noticed. Almost no one. Because 40 miles away, in the quiet suburb of New Hyde Park, one parent did notice. His name was Stephen Engel. He was Jewish, a father of 5, a believer in civic responsibility and religious freedom. Engel wasn't an activist. He wasn't anti-God, but he was deeply concerned because to him, this wasn't just a harmless tradition. It was the government writing a prayer. The state putting words about God into the mouths of children. And Engel understood something many others overlooked. When the government leads the prayer, it's not neutral. It's theological. Even if it's vague, even if it's optional. To Engel, this wasn't about anti-religion. It was about protecting religion from the state. So he gathered a group of like-minded parents and took the most American step you can take when something seems wrong. He filed a lawsuit against William Vitale, the school board president. The case became Engel v. Vitale, and at the heart of it was a deceptively simple question, one that would end up in the front of the United States Supreme Court. Can a public school write and promote a prayer, even if it's optional, and even if it's vaguely religious? It sounded like a legal technicality, but buried inside the question were much bigger ones. Where does the line between faith and public life actually fall? Can neutrality ever truly be neutral? And who gets to decide what God even means? Most people thought this was a minor case. They didn't see it coming, but history rarely announces itself. Sometimes it starts in a government office with a 22-word prayer and ends in a courtroom that redefines a nation. Section 2. A nation on edge. To understand why this case hit so hard, why it sparked outrage, headlines, and Sunday sermons, you have to understand the moment. This was Cold War America. What frightened people was more than war. It was the communist worldview. Communism wasn't just an economic theory. It was an existential threat, a system that in the American imagination wanted to destroy not just capitalism, but God. It wanted to take down everything the country had built. The Soviets banned religion. They bulldozed churches, they replaced worship with allegiance to the state. And so, in the 1950s, Americans did what anxious nations always do. They overcorrected. We wrapped our flag in a choir robe, we baptized our politics in the language of piety, and in 1954, Congress added the phrase, under God, to the Pledge of Allegiance. 2 years later, in 1956, In God We Trust became the national motto, replacing E pluribus unum, the original post-revolutionary phrase meaning out of many one. Church attendance surged, religious language flooded presidential speeches, and you couldn't tell where faith ended and patriotism began. To be American in this cultural moment was to be publicly religious, or at the very least, to acknowledge the Judeo-Christian scaffolding underneath the whole project. So when Engel versus Vitale reached the Supreme Court, it wasn't just about a prayer in a schoolroom. It was about national identity. Was this a Christian nation? A city on a hill? A moral beacon against godless communism? Or was it something messier? Something more pluralistic? A country not defined by a singular faith, but by the freedom to have or not have one. And here's where it gets tricky. To some, Engel versus Vitale felt like a betrayal, as if the government, in trying to protect religious neutrality, had cut America loose from its moral anchor. To others, it was a long overdue boundary, a way of saying the state can't be your priest and president, and your fate doesn't need to be managed by a government committee. But beneath it all was the lingering question of America. Were we a Christian nation or a nation with Christians in it? And depending on how you answered that, Engel versus Vitale was either a dangerous step towards secularism or a courageous defense of religious liberty. Section 3, the verdict that shook the church. In 1962, the Supreme Court issued its decision in Engel versus Vitale, 6-1. The court struck down the school prayer, not because it mentioned Jesus, not because it forced kids to pray, not even because it offended any particular religious group. They struck it down because of who wrote it, the state. New York Board of Regents. Government officials, unelected, unordained, had drafted a prayer and handed it to children as a morning ritual. The majority opinion delivered by Justice Hugo Black didn't mince words.
It is no part of the business of the government to compose official prayers for any group of the American people.
And with that one sentence, a cultural fault line split open. To some, the decision felt like the beginning of the end. Newspapers lit up, pastors railed from pulpits, parents panicked. To them, this wasn't just about one prayer, it was symbolic. A sign that America was sliding off its moral foundation, that God had been expelled from the classroom, exiled from the public square, and replaced with moral relativism and secularism. This was the moment, many said, when the floodgates opened. School shootings, teen rebellions, rising divorce rates, cultural wars. In their mind, it all started here, with the government banning God. But others saw something very different. They didn't see it as a loss of morality. They saw it as a victory for religious liberty. Because what the court struck down, it was a government-written prayer. It was the idea that the state had the right or the theological competence to tell children how to talk to God. In other words, the court wasn't kicking God out of schools, it was keeping Caesar out of the prayer meeting. But here's what was forgotten, buried beneath the rhetoric and rage. Prayer wasn't banned. Students could still bow their heads. They could still carry a Bible. They could form clubs, pray in groups, talk about faith in essays, and read scripture at lunch. The only thing they couldn't do was be led in prayer by the state. But let's be real. Nuances, they rarely make the news. The headline wasn't, "Court defends religious freedom by preventing state interference in prayer practices." No. The headline was, "God banned from schools." Because that's simpler, and it's scarier, and it's stickier, and it caught fire. TV preachers picked it up, politicians turned it into stump speeches, and for decades afterwards, Engel versus Vitale became the shorthand for everything some Christians felt was going wrong with the country. But lost in all the outrage was this subtle, powerful truth. The court didn't outlaw prayer. It protected it. Because once the government starts writing your prayers, it's not long before it starts rewriting your beliefs. Section 4, freedom of religion or freedom from religion. Here's the real tension this case reveals. It's one thing to say we believe in freedom of religion. It's another thing entirely to live with it, especially when that freedom makes us uncomfortable. Because freedom of religion isn't just the freedom to pray, it's also the freedom not to. It's the freedom to worship your God or another God or no God at all. And when that freedom shows up in public, especially in schools where impressionable minds gather, things get messy fast. Because when the state starts praying, we have to ask, whose God is being invoked? Is it the God of the Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Catholics, the Pentecostal? Is he Trinitarian? Is he personal? Does he listen to you if you don't fold your hands just right? And when a teacher leads a classroom in prayer, even if it's optional, even if it's vague, whose theology is being promoted? What doctrines are implied? What beliefs are reinforced? And who feels alienated by them? For many Christians, especially in the majority culture, it feels like no big deal. It's just a generic nod to the divine. Why make a fuss? But for others, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, even Baptists who historically resisted state interference in religion, this wasn't paranoia. It was real and a deep-rooted concern. Because history has taught them again and again what happens when the government becomes the chaplain. And here's the irony. The same Christians who once fled Europe to escape state-run religion now found themselves defending state-ridden prayers in public schools. And there were deeper issues at hand. What happens when we confuse Christian power with Christian faithfulness? When we believe that in order for the gospel to thrive, it needs political scaffolding. When we assume the answer to spiritual decline is government enforcement. Engel verse Vitale wasn't just about a 22-word prayer. It was about the limits of religious influence in public life, the boundaries between personal faith and public policy, and the question of how faith can stay faithful in a pluralistic society. Because here's the danger. When Christianity becomes too cozy with power, when it trades its prophetic voice for a seat at the table, it loses something. It stops being a kingdom not of this world, and it starts just becoming another voting bloc. We think we're gaining influence, but more often we're losing clarity. We're trading the scandal of the gospel for the safety of civil religion. And once that happens, it becomes harder to tell the difference between genuine faith and patriotic theater. So yes, Engel verse Vitale took prayer out of the hands of the state. But maybe, just maybe, that was the right place to start. Because the gospel doesn't need government sponsorship to survive. It's made it through prisons, underground churches, in fields and forests, and refugee camps. It even survived crucifixion. But what it can't survive for long is being domesticated. So what do we do with this? Should Christians be angry that school prayer is gone? Should we fight to bring it back? Or maybe the better question is, when do we start believing that faith needed a government microphone to stay alive? Because if the gospel is true, it can handle a silent classroom, it can handle a secular court, it can even handle being misunderstood. But what it can't handle is being diluted into a safe, state-approved version of itself. Jesus, he never asked Caesar to lead his prayers. And maybe we shouldn't either.